If we want to get at the problem of mass shootings, we need to stop blaming them on people with mental illnesses and ask harder, deeper questions about our conceptions of masculinity and entitlement.
Just think, like, throughout all of human history, only in the modern age, when some people are thinking about society and they think we are civilized, just like the 1700s and the 1800s, like we were like, and today we still have wars. We still are blowing each other up. We're still like easily marching soldiers across borders, blowing up villages. How many drone strikes do we launch and we're just blowing up villages and getting like civilian casualties, killing children and stuff like that? That's what our government is doing. And that's what governments all around the world are doing. Humanity as a whole is a pretty violent species. And I think that when you just look at the amount of killings and the amount of violent crime committed against one another, you really think that you would look at that and go, oh, they're just all mentally ill. They're just all mentally ill. So you might as well just say like every like society ever, the entire society is just mentally ill. And there's just a small little group of sane people that are trying to pay their mortgage, invest in some stocks, and have the, the TradCon life. Everyone else in the world around them is just absolutely bonkers, and it's only them that have any type of sane place in reality. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Unfortunately, this week, I have to make an apology. And I am apologizing because of misinformation that I accidentally spread in a previous video. Well, I won't say accidentally because I did make the video with intention. However, some of the information that we had said in that video was inaccurate. And we take it serious enough that we've taken down that video to offer correction to it and to take corrective actions by producing this video. The information in question was about mental illness and mass shooters and gun violence in general. And in that video, we had speculated that surely there must be some type of mental illness going on with mass shooters. And we had made that statement with no statistics to back it up. And it was based on an assumption on repeated claims that we've heard from many other people and our own intuitions, feeling that if somebody's going to go and commit a mass shooting and they're premeditating this sort of thing, then there must be something that is mentally ill with them. That's not the case. There's no evidences to back that up. And we want to set the record straight and to make sure that we promote only good information on our channel and make sure that it's accurate information and offer redactions or to correct yourself when we do mess up. In that video, we definitely had messed up. So it is no longer viewable on our channel, and we're going to make this video to replace it and hopefully correct any of the misinformation that we could have been spreading. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to a presenter at a TED Talk specifically talking about mass shooters and mental illness. And then we'll be reacting to that content. After that, we're going to pull up an article by the American Psychology Association, and we're going to read about mental illness and violence. Because over the last couple of years of going through our own therapy and dealing with our own mental health issues, we realized that we face a lot of the same types of struggles that people, especially in the media, like to speculate cause people to go commit like mass violence or whatever else. in the form of certain disorders that we have, that a lot of people, especially in the online area as well, like to attempt to tie to violence in order to make us out to look like dangerous people. So in the interest of correcting some of the misinformation that we spread, we're going to go ahead and start the TED Talk now. And hopefully, between listening to their presenter and reading the article and discussing why we need to be nuanced with this subject and why we need to be careful with this type of rhetoric, we can all learn something together and we can all grow. So if you're in the camp that when you hear a mass shooter or gun violence and you automatically think to yourself intuitively, oh, this person's mentally ill, please watch this video with me. Let's learn together. And or if you are a conservative and you think this is a valid argument, you think that this really is one of the primary causes of gun violence, then you should join us as well. And let's see if you still think that by the end of the video. So with that, this is the presenter, Carmela Epright, and she is talking about mass shooters and mental illness.
Everything that you have been told about mass shooters and mental illness is wrong. You have been told that in order to prevent these shootings, we have to do something about mental illness. The implication being that only a mentally ill person would commit such an atrocity.
Now, intuitively, that's where most people come from. They just think to themselves, yeah, if you committed some heinous act, whatever, you must not be in your right frame of mind. And it's so alluring to take the lazy route and just follow your intuition on something like this. But when it comes to any aspect of human behavior, when it comes to any human expression, even violence itself, we need to be careful in how we are appraising this and trying to determine of what the causation was for it.
But I'm going to explain why this assumption is wrong. Most mass shooters do not meet the court standard for criminal insanity.
All right. And this is a big thing right here. So whenever someone says that, well, they must be criminally insane, I always ask the person that makes this claim, now, under what criterion are they trying to diagnose this person? What specific illnesses are they trying to say, or traits of an illness are they saying is the causation for this behavior? Because I'm not aware of any of them.
Nor do they meet any particular diagnostic criteria for mental illness. And to assume that they are all mentally ill stigmatizes genuinely mentally ill people.
Right. And we can tell you right now, the last thing that people that deal with a lot of mental illness need is more stigma. We are aware that people get uncomfortable if we use our plural pronouns in public. We constantly try to remind myself that I and mine are the pronouns that everyone else uses, and other people do not deal with the same experiences that we have.
People who are already inappropriately feared, poorly served by our medical community, and subject to violence, homelessness, and social isolation.
Right. And then think about, on top of all of that, if you're dealing with any type of minority community that also has the background radiation of stigma that society also puts on those communities, there's even more pressure being put on those people. And those people are often treated even worse or demonized more. How often do you see conservative media just falling over themselves to report a crime anytime the perpetrator is a person of color? But when it's a white kid especially if they're a young, attractive white kid, then all of a sudden, something must have went wrong to put them in that place. And they want to say, well, wait a minute, wait. We got to look at every single aspect of this person's life, every nuance that we can examine before we jump to any conclusions. But if it's a person of color, if it's another minority group, like a trans person, they'll say, oh, well, they're trans. I mean, like, they're, clearly, like, just look at them. And that sort of lazy thinking is what we have got to combat when it comes to these types of issues.
And finally, I will explain why making this assumption undermines our ability to genuinely understand why these shootings occur. So let me begin by explaining what criminal mental illness is. This is Daniel Mcnaughton.
Right. Because if we're talking about if you're making accusations, well, this person is like criminally mentally ill, or they'll say dangerously mentally ill, we should start by defining it. And I appreciate her effort in this case. And I feel like the average person has difficulty. I just don't see how you jump to conclusions of looking to somebody who might be like talking to themselves, or somebody who seems to be acting a little strange, then come to the conclusion that not only are they mentally ill, but that makes them dangerous. That's just not the case.
In 1843 London, Mcnaughton shot the Prime Minister's personal secretary, believing him to be the Prime Minister himself. He acted on a long-standing delusion that the Tories were following him and endangering his life. England, like the United States, believes that in order to be truly guilty of a crime, you have to autonomously choose to commit it.
Right. So this is where we're getting into. You have to be cognizant of the crime. That's why you talk about premeditation is so important in court, because you want to establish a motive, you want to establish premeditation, you want to determine that the person was in a right state of mind, because it's about accountability and autonomy. Did that person have the ability to choose to do something different? Were they in a state of mind that would allow them to choose something different than they chose?
Hence the standard that carries Mcnaughton's name. The Mcnaughton standard asks the question, did the defendant know that the act was wrong at the time in which it was committed? And if the answer to that question is no, then they cannot be held criminally responsible. Not every state in the United States has a version of the insanity defense, but those that do use some version of this standard.
Yeah, I'll give you a guess which states probably do not allow the insanity defense. Can we guess Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, just the South. I'm going to guess we'll find mostly in the South they don't allow it. How about Arkansas, Utah? We'll guess like those states. Probably red states, if we had to take a guess. Because, as you know, not only do conservatives, on average, hate minority groups, they also hate people that struggle with mental health issues.
Some additionally recognize that knowledge of wrongfulness itself is not sufficient. That one can know that something is wrong, but be so out of touch with reality that they are not able to control their behavior.
Right, and I think what she's talking about here would be like somebody having a true obsession about something. And we know that like stalkers and that sort of thing. And people that do become obsessed or fixated on another person and become, obsessed in an unhealthy way might become convinced that they have some type of relationship with this person, or this person is actually like a good friend of theirs or whatever else. But when they keep getting pushback from other people, or they get restraining orders, whatever, they know that they're not supposed to be engaged in that behavior. But for a lot of people that are under certain conditions like that, they might still end up stalking that person anyway. It does happen.
Let me be clear. Most of the shooters that you have heard about on the news, those with household names like Eric Harris, Chris Harper Mercer, James Holmes, or Dylan Roof, were not compelled by mental illness to open fire in a classroom, a movie theater, a church, or a parking lot.
All right. So a lot of the shooters that she just named right there are going to be familiar to a lot of y'all. And as she is confirming, none of them are diagnosed with any type of mental illness. Not anything that would lead them to commit any type of crime like that, because there is no mental illness diagnostic criteria that makes somebody a mass shooter. And I think it's very important that when we think about these names, if you also recall mugshots of these perpetrators that were spread around, or sensationalized headlines about the shooter afterward, with the media's goal of turning this person not only into somebody who would go and commit some type of mass shooting, especially in a classroom or something like that, but to also make them out to be like this weird, mysterious, oh my gosh, this person they must be so different from the rest of us. Their mind must work so different that they have some type of delusion or fantasy that makes them into this killer.
These men were not out of touch with reality. They knew what they were doing, they made a choice to act, and they could have made a different decision.
Right. And now, I know some of you might be like, oh, deterministically. We're not talking about deterministically. We're saying that, in the event of were they in a state of mind where if they had considered their actions, if they thought about it long enough or reasoned or went out and reached for help, could they have put themselves on a different path? And for those shooters, yeah, they probably could.
The Mcnaughton Rule is rigorous. It is only claimed in approximately 1% of all criminal trials, and it's only successful about 25% of the time. This is to say that our courts rarely find it to be the case that people commit terrible acts because they're mentally ill.
Right, and it takes a lot more for a mental health, like a insanity defense to be successful in court than just somebody going and doing some bizarre behavior. Some people will be like, oh, you just go in there and like pull your pants down in front of the judge or something like that. Don't do that. It's illegal. And on top of that, it's not going to just suddenly magically get you an insanity defense and some type of like technicality or something like that. There are processes and evaluations to be diagnosed with certain conditions. You're not going to go and like just pull your pants down and say, oh, now now you get to go free because you're clearly insane.
And frankly, we don't believe that either. We don't automatically assume that people who beat their children or kill their neighbors or commit armed robberies do so because they are mentally ill. For example,
now, I would bet most people in my audience know somebody who is very violent or has a very violent temper. And just statistically, you definitely know people that have done physical violence to other people, or probably would do physical violence to other people if they could get away with it. It's this type of thing to be cognizant about, that the behaviors that she listed that sound awful and are awful are often perpetrated by people in a perfectly right frame of mind. There are people that can be abusive in their families, to their spouses, or to their children, or to their friends and family, whatever else, and they are all perfectly sane people. You probably have coworkers that you can think about that you're like, man, this person seems to have a very violent temper, and I bet if they got angry enough or somebody pushed them hard enough, that you could imagine some problems going down. Or there might even be coworkers who are like, man, I get nervous when I work with this person because they seem so aggressive, and I always worry when there's a conflict at work, like, man, I hope they don't do something.
nobody believes that that this man, his name is Bernie Madoff, acted as he did, which is bankrupting elderly people and children's charities, literally taking money away from kids with cancer.
Wait, isn't the Trump family banned from running like children's charities because they did the same thing? I know it's totally like as a side note, but when we look at Bernie Madoff, and I think like, oh my gosh, this is like such a awful human being. When I hear about the behavior of being like, look, stealing money from a children's charity, especially children with cancer, it's like, it's just so weird that we actually had a former president engage in that exact same behavior. It's awful. Bernie Madoff is an awful person. And yeah, Donald Trump, awful human being as well.
Because he was unable to control his actions. Mass shooters are in this situation. They are able to control their actions.
Right. Bernie Madoff engaged in a gigantic Ponzi scheme that was premeditated, pre-planned, everything else. Mass shooters often do the exact same types of things as far as pre-planning, getting access to weapons or stockpiling ammunition, whatever else. Absolutely the case. That is premeditated, planned behavior, not something that somebody who is like severely mentally ill is going to just go like that person. If you are saying that they have such difficulty staying in reality, I don't see how this person is going to go and plan something this intricate and have the follow through with it to just continuously stay on this course. This is something that typically sane people do.
And when pundits and politicians insist that when it comes to a mass shooting, they must be caused by mental illness, what it does is stigmatizes mentally ill people. We don't think about our children, our neighbors, our siblings, or ourselves.
Yeah, and our siblings, us, our parents, we're mentally ill people. Like, people within your family struggle with mental health. If you struggle with depression, that's a type of mental health struggle. I think it cannot be overstated how many people that you probably know have encountered have some type of mental illness or some type of mental health journey that they are on. And I think it's ridiculous to say that every single one of those people must somehow be dangerous as compared to people who do not have some type of mental health journey that they're on. I know I said it once before, it is incredibly ableist, but that type of flawed thinking would actually put you in a lot more danger because you're not actually looking skeptically at the people who are more likely to commit these crimes. And it might also put us in a position where you go, oh, well, we have all of this solved. Like, we know who to look at and who to focus all of our resources in investigating. Meanwhile, the largest groups of people that actually commit these crimes just go unnoticed. Well, not totally unnoticed. We have the data. We know that the communities that a lot of these mass shooters are coming from. And guess what? It's not hives of mentally ill people.
Our minds do not turn to the people that we know and love who suffer from depression or anxiety or PTSD. Our minds do not turn to the 45 million Americans who suffer from some form or another of mental illness. Instead, our minds turn to a tiny minority, that is, people who are actively mentally ill. And it's not this number of 11 million adults. It's a much smaller, tiny minority of those people who are actively psychotic, who are subject to delusions and hallucinations. Our minds turn to the homeless people that we have seen speaking to invisible companions.
Right. And then even of the people that might be in a psychotic state, that might have delusions or hallucinations. Only a fraction of those people are going to be like statistically any more violent than anyone else. And even that group of people, substance abuse is the highest predictor as far as violent behavior. Use of certain drugs, and of course alcohol. Alcohol is a major factor in violent crimes and also suicide. But we have periodically, if we have enough stress, sometimes we can experience hallucinations ourselves. And they do nothing but scare us sometimes or make us paranoid. However, because of counseling, therapy, and that sort of thing, we are often aware to do reality testing. And if we perceive something that we think is out of the ordinary, we might ask somebody like, hey, did you see that over there? Or do you see this thing over here? As one measure. So at least one measure to confirm our reality. So there's not any predictor to say like, well, just because you have some hallucinations, that does not necessarily mean that you are going to be violent. That, hallucinations are a wide spectrum of things.
They turn to people that we're already afraid of. They turn to people who are crazy, that we call crazy. They turn to people that we believe to be dangerous and out of control. What you don't know is that mentally ill people, and in particularly severely mentally ill people, are far, far more likely to be victims rather than perpetrators of violence.
Right. And then, isn't this is what we find over and over when you have a minority community that people are like, oh, they're you got to worry about these people. They're so violent and get so worked up about them. So often, those communities are also the highest number of victims. They are more than likely the victims of those crimes. And we're talking about severely mentally ill people. Exactly that. More likely to be victimized than to actually be an abuser themselves. Now, we've talked before about having BPD. And that's one of the illnesses that's a favorite of conservatives to essentially just accuse people of, or if they do find out you have it, to try and claim that you're mentally unstable in some way that's going to cause you to abuse somebody or be a violent person. And while it is true that some people with BPD can be violent, so can any other average person or a person that does not have a borderline. But the other thing that they fail to mention is that borderliners very often are the abused in abusive relationships that they're involved in. And it's one of the reasons is because borderliners can get very attached to people and can forgive a lot of actions that other people would have already ended a relationship over. I myself was in an abusive relationship, and I don't want to get into explicit details because it can be a little much to handle. But in that relationship, things escalated and escalated and escalated and escalated. And the people that knew us after the relationship was over and after it had gone to as extreme as it did, they would say, oh, well, I was always thinking that, you should have left when this happened. You should have left when this happened. You should have left when this happened. And it's easy to say that in retrospect. But when you are in that type of relationship where somebody is making you feel dependent on them, especially if you have a disorder that can make you attached to people or make you see this person in a very positive way where you feel like they could do no wrong, it can be very difficult for us to escape a situation like that. And it can lead to us being abused, which it often does. So just something to remember when you see people talking about borderliners are dangerous or borderliners are abusive to everybody around them. We are more often the abuse person in a relationship more than we abuse anybody.
What you don't know is that less than 5% of all violent crimes are committed by people with a mental illness. You don't know that most mentally ill people are not violent, and most violence is not committed by persons with a mental illness.
I feel like this should intuitively be something that we recognize when you think of like most crime, just in general, not focusing on violent crime, because that's the area where it's like, yeah, intuitively, a lot of people say, oh, well, they just must do this or think this, whatever else. What I would say is a lot of crime, like the Bernie Madoffs and the property crime or the theft and, heists or, any crime that requires a lot of premeditation. I don't think that people necessarily go there with mental illness. But when you talk about violent crimes, for whatever reason, that's where people jump to right away. And as we said before, we had spread misinformation about this, definitely trying to correct that now. But we were talking specifically at the time of mass shootings, and we were wrong about that too. So it's not even in that case.
Most mass shooters plan their crimes far in advance. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold meticulously planned the Columbine massacre for a full year before committing it. Chris Harper Mercer posted his intentions and sought advice from a community on social media about how best to carry out his attack, in which he killed 9 of his classmates in an Oregon community college. Dylan Roof, the Charleston church shooter, also posted his...
Now, every single one of these shooters were made to look out to be mentally ill. And I remember a lot of people were saying, oh, you can just look at their eyes and you can tell that they're, mentally ill by looking at their eyes. That type of rhetoric doesn't help anybody and is full of garbage. There's no such thing as looking at people's eyes to tell if they're a psychopath or a killer or whatever else. I've seen on the internet where people say, oh, there's, I think they call it like Sampuku eyes, where it's like the 3 whites or whatever. If you can see the 3 whites on their eyes, you know that they're crazy or they're a dangerous person. That is not true. You cannot just look at somebody's eyes and tell whether they are a killer, mentally ill, anything like that.
His intentions and sought advice from his community of white supremacists.
Are we surprised that a lot of these shooters come out of communities of white supremacists? Because one of the things that I did get right in that video, because I had checked those statistics, was that, most of these shooters are associated with white nationalism, white supremacy. They just are. They're a hateful group. And when you see them, the way that they operate online, especially like on Kiwi Farms or 4chan, you can just look and see what toxic hellholes those communities are. I'm not surprised that people that spend a lot of time in these types of cesspools, absorbing those types of ideas and all the violence and hatred and bigotry that exists within those spaces. I'm not surprised that those people become radicalized enough, or they decide that they hate some member of a minority group enough that they could actually decide to launch some type of attack. Although I would say that there are other variables besides just being part of some hate internet forum that are stronger predictors of violent behavior, but we'll get into that in the article section.
If we want to get at the problem of mass shootings, we need to stop blaming them on people with mental illnesses and ask harder, deeper questions about our conceptions of masculinity and entitlement.
Just think, throughout all of human history, only in the modern age, when some people are thinking about society and they think we are civilized. Just like the 1700s and the 1800s, like we were like, and today we still have wars. We still are blowing each other up. We're still like easily marching soldiers across borders, blowing up villages. How many drone strikes do we launch and we're just blowing up villages and getting like civilian casualties, killing children and stuff like that? That's what our government is doing. And that's what governments all around the world are doing. Humanity as a whole is a pretty violent species. And I think that when you just look at the amount of killings and the amount of violent crime committed against one another, you really think that you would look at that and go, oh, they're just all mentally ill. They're just all mentally ill. So you might as well just say like every like society ever, the entire society is just mentally ill. And there's just a small little group of sane people that are trying to pay their mortgage, invest in some stocks, and have the TradCon life. Everyone else in the world around them is just absolutely bonkers, and it's only them that have any type of sane place in reality. That's the extreme that you would have to believe if you believe that all the violence in society is attached to mentally ill people somehow. There's just not that many of us. I got to tell you. Then of those that do have the types of illnesses that people like to try to tie to violent crimes, there's only a small percentage of that group that's committing any crime. So the minority of the minority. Now you could say the same thing. Oh, well, aren't you going to say that of these white guys that are mass shooters, what population of white men are these shooters? The difference is that a lot of these shooters are consuming the media from these communities. They are getting further radicalized by these communities. And when you say like, well, what's the percentages compared to mentally ill people compared to the percentages of just white guys, it turns out that, the white guys, even though there are more of you by numbers, you're statistically per capita more likely to be violent murderers as well. So maybe don't throw stones in a glass house.
About these young men who act as pseudo-commandos. And that is as people who kill in public during the day. They come armed with an arsenal of weapons and ammunition. They brag about what they're intending to do.
Or they live stream it. Remember the Christchurch shooter, Lauren Southern's fanboy? It's kind of weird that she's been tied to two like mass shooters. And it's odd that a lot of larger content creators that are especially in the political arena cozy up to these type of people, knowing that some fraction of their audience is a safe haven for those types of individuals and are really radicalizing them. And yet they want to act like the trans community or something like that is the threat to society when their own communities are producing these motherfuckers.
And they want to kill as many people as possible. Pseudo-commandos are not driven by mental illness. They're driven by anger and resentment. This is a quote from Dylan Klebold to one of the victims at Columbine who he permitted to live. The quote is, "We've always wanted to do this. We've dreamed of doing it for years. This is for all the shit that you put us through, and this is what you..."
Now that quote right there, I guarantee you that would be something like mild that you would see on like 4chan posts. Y'all, you know this. Like 4chan stuff will post so much more extreme stuff than that when they're imagining their homicidal ideation. I will say that if you exist in a community or spaces where this type of rhetoric would be considered very tame, you should take a good, hard look at the community that you're in and really take stock of, are these just memes? Are these just people blowing off steam? Are these just people that, society is mistreated or treated in some type of way that would justify them desiring to do something like this.
Deserve. That is not someone speaking from mental illness. That is someone speaking from anger and resentment. There's even a community of sorts that sprung up on the internet to support those who feel aggrieved and entitled, who feel as though they are not getting what they deserve from society in general and from women in particular. And I so want...
What society is going to pop up? Do you think it's like leftist trans people that are about to pop up? I'll leave it like, you can pause it here and you can go like put in the comments about what group do you think is going to show up whenever she hits this little clicker.
Wanted to introduce you to their mascot. They have their own mascot. His name is Pepe the Frog, and Pepe dresses up in different...
Not Pepe. What? You little psycho. No. So this video was in the Beta Rebellion. Jesus. This video is from like 2016. I know that Pepe has been like reclaimed by the left or whatever, so everybody uses Pepe. But at the time that this was filmed, yeah, the communities that were using Pepe were definitely like the alt-right. And we'll get into the alt-right in another video, because there is a group that is like, it's fascinating to read that people are like, oh, the alt-right is gone. The alt-right doesn't exist. You're just paranoid. You're just paranoid. There is a group that is very influential, has tons of money behind it, and also is connected to a lot of very like big name figures on the right. And yeah, it exists. It existed before the alt-right. It got a big boost in membership. They're all like white supremacist scumbags, but that's not going to be in this video. What I'll say is, yeah, there are plenty of people, there are plenty of hate communities that still use Pepe, but Pepe has been reclaimed by the left as well. It's not just their mascot, but I mean, like, yeah, the Revolutionary Alliance of Men that women find unattractive. I've told incels this before, that they need to get out of those communities. If you're an incel and you feel isolated and this community is the only place that you have to go, you can find other internet communities. You do deserve love and you deserve respect, and you should not be abused, mistreated, and aligned as if you just are a mass shooter. So I do want to specify that I acknowledge that there's only a small group of incels that are also shooters, and that for most of you, you are just misunderstood and frustrated with society, and there are some legitimate concerns that the people that operate in those communities might have as far as society abusing them or mistreating them in some type of way. However, that will never justify violence against other people. And even though trans communities and the LGBT community is abused by societies, I don't think incels would say, oh yeah, trans people should totally go do what their community does. I don't understand if you are that desperate for attention and you also want to be respected in a place that validates you. It should not invalidate the worst aspects of your character, and it should not celebrate you feeling misery and urging you to commiserate in a space that is filled with people who are just rotten to their core. You need to get away from those people. There are other communities out there for you.
Different outfits and carries a gun. The Beta Rebellion, Betas consider themselves a revolutionary alliance of men who are not found attractive by women.
All right. Remember when I did that video on the alpha, beta, whatever, the astrology for men? And at the beginning of that video, I said that men do have some concerns. You know, the MRA movement has some points to it. But the toxicity of what believing in that type of hierarchy causes, especially beta and labeling other men betas and embracing that. I talked about the damage that can do to young men's health. This is a result of that type of rhetoric. It's not. It's way more serious than horoscopes. It's way more serious than any type of when you want to like make fun of a like Myers-Briggs test, and you're like, oh, women talking about their animal signs or Chinese zodiac. Oh, it's so cringe, and she wants to like read about the next date that she's going to go on or something like that. You can say whatever you want to. Those women are not committing mass acts of violence against society. But the community that supports the idea of this alpha beta hierarchy, this male hierarchy, is producing radical young men that have nothing but hatred for society and do want to commit mass acts of violence. Not all of them, obviously. And I would hope that most of them would, hopefully, if they did ever see the video that we made on that, would recognize the toxicity in being convinced of those types of ideas, and why you are no different than a lot of other young men your age and struggling with the exact same types of issues, and that you should find camaraderie with other men and compassion and empathy. You should share that with those men, and also you ought to expect that in return. You should not be mistreated by society or abused by society in general, but at the same time, you cannot wall yourself off in a community that not only is reinforcing those negative beliefs, but also are encouraging you to adopt maladaptive coping strategies. That's an unhealthy place for you, and those communities are only going to make you feel worse about yourself.
A number of recent mass shooters, Chris Harper Mercer being among them, another shooter, Elliot Rogers, the Ista Vista killer, consulted a website called 4chan. They considered themselves betas, and they posted their intentions in advance to get advice from other betas.
Yeah. So exactly what we were just talking about. 4chan, not surprised, not one bit of surprise. Those types of websites are just so damaging, and they identified themselves as betas, something that doesn't exist other than in this fictional toxic masculinity hierarchy on the internet.
For example, Chris Harper Mercer, an anonymous poster, gave him this advice. I suggest that you enter a classroom and that you put everyone in a corner and tell them that you're going to hold them hostage, and then you open fire on them. That is not a person who is mentally ill or driven by a hallucination or a delusion.
And that's the community taking advantage of his poor mental health state, of all the stressors in his life, where he's been radicalized by this community. He's not mentally ill. He's pressured and encouraged to do the things that he did after he's already been brought down and ripped apart by this community and told that he's worthless, but he could have value to them if he goes and does these certain things. Then he could be like a hero to them. That is dangerous rhetoric from them. And average people with no mental health issues whatsoever, even if you are in a state where you have poor mental health, and when I say that, I'm drawing a distinction between somebody who actually has like a mental illness versus somebody who is just suffering a lot at the time, or just has like a negative self-perception because they feel like life is not going their way. They are being taken advantage of these sites, and these sites are radicalizing them, and other people who feel just as frustrated or just as powerless are just sitting on the edge of their computer chair when they can, when can they manipulate the next person to send back out into society to end up in the same way that these other mass shooters end up in. And that's something that we ought to take very seriously. Kiwi Farms is like absolutely notorious for swatting people. The site has also encouraged numerous people to take their own lives via suicide. And now we've got 4chan that we know has produced several mass shooters. This is ought to be concerning to everybody, especially even if you are a conservative, because a lot of the people within these communities also are a far right.
That is a person who collected a community of support. So I'm going to end with a message worth hearing, and that is that blaming mentally ill people for mass shootings is very comforting. It allows us to believe that they are not like us.
Just as a reminder of what I said before, think about how many people murder people every day across this planet engaged in various wars. And I know people say, well, war times, except you're still killing people. And then all the pillaging and everything else that can go along there. Then just think all the other violent crime, all the other assaults, all the other, armed robberies, all the other murders that are going to go on besides warfare. All of that mass violence. There's like close to 7.5 billion people on this planet. There is a staggering amount of violence that happens every single day. It's just absurd to say that every single one of these acts is probably tied to some person that has mental illness.
That they are not normal, even though we know that normal people are the ones who commit 95% of all violent acts. It also permits us to avoid difficult political and social reforms because, there's only so much you can do to fix crazy. But the problem is this comfort comes at a tremendous cost.
I'm kind of curious. I think so. Keffels was swatted not too long ago, and essentially had to flee the country. Keffels is a prominent trans figure on Twitter, on Twitch, YouTube, and they were swatted twice, doxxed multiple times, and ended up having to flee the country. A sitting U.S. State Senator, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I think is an absolute piece of shit, but she's a far-right conservative. She also was swatted by Kiwi Farms, and she was swatted twice. Now, let's just think for a second, because Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and said one thing that I think one of the only things I've ever heard come out of her mouth that we agreed on, when she said that websites like this ought not be allowed. They should be shut down. I'm curious, do you think that knowing what we know as far as the types of things that people that are on Kiwi Farms engage in, and we know the cost of allowing websites like 4chan to stay up and operate, do you think that the cost to our society and the public risk that these sites pose on us all the time, do you think it's worth letting those sites stay up? I'd be curious to hear any responses to what anybody thinks on that. My answer is no, of course. I don't think that sites that exist only to abuse its members, to radicalize them, to psychologically damage them, and then direct a lot of that anger out at other communities across the internet and to cause real life harm to people. I do not think that sites like that ought to be allowed or ought to be operated. And it's absurd to us that the government has not done something to just ban those websites.
It stigmatizes an already stigmatized and marginal group. But more importantly, it prevents us from answering the genuine question: why would a sane person commit such an act? Thank you.
Right. Remember all the other factors that I said earlier? Like, what about, poverty and that sort of thing? All those factors are going to contribute a lot to those factors, like why people end up engaging in a lot of this violence. Like, in general. I know that I said that I was going to go over an article, which is from the American Psychological Association. This video is like running way longer than we intended it to. Didn't think that we were going to have as much to talk about as we did, but as the video is going on and we were listening to it, there was more and more that we did want to say on it or comment on it, especially adding some of the background about those websites, because I do think they pose a danger to our society, and that something should be done about them. So this article is mental illness and violence debunking myths, addressing realities. Let's see here. Growing body of research is helping to tease apart why some people with serious mental illness are prone to violence and while others are not, and how clinicians and others can help through improved treatment and informed myth busting. This is by, it looks like, Tori DeAngelis, and it was updated July 11th, 2022. Originally created April 1st, 2021. It says it's about a 16-minute read, so we're going to try to get through this quickly. All right. It's just talking about what the goal is of. So, let's see here. Many health service psychologists will, at some point in their careers, evaluate, treat, or study a relatively small number of people with serious mental illness who have committed or have the potential to commit violence toward others. Most often, they see these individuals in psychiatric inpatient or forensic settings, but occasionally in private practice as well. Many more psychologists have also treated clients who have contemplated or even completed suicide, considered by some to be violence against the self. To aid in their understanding of the challenge, there's a growing body of research that is helping to tease apart why some people, while perpetrating violence, is relatively uncommon among those with serious mental illness. When it does occur, in many cases, it is intertwined with other issues such as co-occurring substance use, adverse childhood experiences, and environmental factors. Says Eric, I'm sorry, I'm going to get your name, Elbogen, a psychologist, professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at the Duke University School of Medicine, who studies violence and mental illness. I know that for YouTube, the idea of you're going to read an article and go over an article, that doesn't sound exciting to a lot of people. And I know a lot of people prefer the kind of reactionary content where, I watch Ben Shapiro or something and start debunking a lot of his dumb myths. I really do think this information is important. I would not make a video this long on it if I did not think that people should hear this information, should get this information. Simply because it is a topic that is coming up more and more frequently as there are, increases in mass shootings. And at the same time, I do want to make sure that it's not being hand-waved away all the time as mental illness. And I recognize now why that is a conservative talking point. And by the way, I just want to make sure that when I'm saying it's a conservative talking point, it's conservative rhetoric. I want to make sure that everyone understands that I don't mean that it's wrong because a conservative says it. I'm saying that we ought to be skeptical of every claim that we hear. And I feel like the claim that mental illness is directly related to mass shootings is something that is propagated a lot on conservative media. I know that there are also some on the left that say the same thing, but it definitely comes from a conservative area more often. I think that because this is such a common tactic, we should read the actual articles and we should watch content that is included with professors and educated people. That's not just YouTubers. Not that, I think that you should watch my video, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge that we need to look at the data, because the data is what matters, not necessarily who it comes from or what they have to say, but we ought to be skeptical of certain sources more so than others, because they are the ones that are engaged in politicizing this rhetoric. All right. It's important to learn about these issues, not only to better treat these individuals and to aid their families and communities, but to combat that misperception that most people with serious mental illness are violent, adds Jeffrey Swanson, PhD medical sociologist at the Duke University School of Medicine and a prominent researcher of the topic. For example, people often believe that people with mental illness are largely responsible for incidents of mass violence, and that people with mental illness are responsible for a large share of community violence. Yet both views have been routinely debunked by research. We need to do some serious myth busting around these ideas, he says, because people believe them and they have real consequences. So this is the state of the knowledge. Overall, people with serious mental illness, which generally refers to those with major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorder, are somewhat more likely than members of the general public to commit acts of violence, research shows. A study by Richard Van Dorn of RTI International and colleagues, for example, found that in a nationally representative community sample of 34,653 people from the national, it looks like epidemiologic survey on alcohol and related conditions, 2.9% of people with serious mental illness had committed violent acts between 2 and 4 years following the study's baseline, compared with 0.08 of people with no serious mental illness or substance use disorder. However, 10% of people with both serious mental illness and substance use disorders committed such acts during that time. Such research may seem to support the notion that people with mental illness pose a danger to society, but a closer look reveals that the situation is more complex, says Elbogen. In the most general sense, there is a link between mental health and violence, he says, but at the same time, most people with severe mental illness are not violent. As important, a growing body of research shows that when people with serious mental illness commit violent or aggressive acts, other factors besides the illness itself are often at play, says Kimberly Brown, PhD, ABPP, and Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Vanderbilt University Medical Center and host of APA 2020 Convention Workshop, which there's a link for it if you want to go check that out. A big factor is co-occurring substance use. If you have both a mental illness and a substance use diagnosis, the combination is synergistic and dangerous, Brown says. Other contextual factors likewise play a part in why people with mental illness may turn to violence or aggression, research finds. In the MacArthur Violent Risk Assessment Study, there's also a link to that, one of the most rigorous and widely cited studies on the topic to date, only 2 clinical symptoms were associated with violent acts among psychiatric inpatients 20 weeks after discharge: command hallucinations, or psychotic voices telling a person to harm others, and psychopathy, characterized by a lack of empathy, poor impulse control, and antisocial deviance, which is not typically considered a mental illness. So yeah, psychopathy is not considered a serious mental illness. It's a trait that everybody has on some spectrum. It is not a mental illness in and of itself. Just as likely play roles were a history of prior violence, a history of childhood physical abuse, having a father who abused substances or was a criminal, displaying antisocial behavior, and scoring high on anger measures. One of the most striking findings from the original MacArthur Violent Risk Assessment Study is an environmental one. When the team compared discharged psychiatric patients without substance use disorder with people from their same neighborhoods, the rates of violence were about the same, says Paul Applebaum, MD, Elizabeth K. Dollar, Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law at Columbia University, and a site principal investigator on MacArthur study. In other words, when neighborhoods are unsafe, poor, and high in crime, violence is an equally likely outcome whether a person has a mental illness or not. In short, says Applebaum, a great deal of what is responsible for violence among people with mental illness may be the same factors that are responsible for violence among people without mental illness. So, driving forces, big research questions. Meanwhile, Elbogen and colleagues have been examining possible internal and situational forces that may drive people with serious mental illness to commit violence. Using data from the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, they examined the potential role of three main domains of risk factors as described in the the I3 model of aggression. Dispositional impellence, or internal factors such as anger and perceived threats that may impel someone to commit violence. Situational impellence, or contextual factors such as divorce or separation, financial problems, or victimization that may foster violence. And disinhibition. External factors such as drug or alcohol intoxication that make it easier for a person to commit violent acts. These factors mitigate the relationship between violence and mental illness. In fact, participants with serious mental illness were less likely to commit violent acts than those without serious mental illness once those factors were removed. And that came from the Clinical Psychological Science, Volume 4, Number 5, published 2016. Despite significant advances in knowledge, however, research in the area is still mixed, says Brown. Some studies find larger links between violence and mental illness than others, and others find no relationship at all. Several reasons help to explain such differences, including that researchers use different population samples in their studies, as well as different definitions and variables to measure violence and mental illness. With violence, for instance, some studies include relatively minor acts of aggression, while others focus exclusively on serious acts of harm toward others. The same is true with mental illness, with some studies of schizophrenia and violence, for example, including only so-called positive symptoms like hallucinations, which are associated with high rates of violence. But other studies find that negative symptoms, such as apathy and loss of motivation, are associated with lower violence rates. And that's from the Archives of General Psychiatry, Volume 64, Number 5, published in 2006. The bottom line: diagnosis alone is never enough to tell you if someone is likely to be violent again in the future, says Brown. Instead, a contextual approach is needed that considers symptoms, circumstances, and individual characteristics, among other factors. In an editorial in the American Journal of Psychiatry, Volume 176, Number 9, published in 2009, Applebaum also points out that many of the current studies, reviews, and meta-analysis in the field rely on data originally collected for other studies, not for the specific purpose of studying the relationship between mental illness and violence. To help move the field forward, he suggests that researchers conduct more prospective studies that use violence as the primary outcome measure and have sufficient power to identify the range of risk-related variables and integrate them into sound theoretical models. Also helpful, he says, would be developing uniform research methods when studying the topic. So, which symptoms lead to violent behavior? Sometimes mental health symptoms in and of themselves can spur a person to aggression or violence. These can include when the person suffers from, and notice, suffers from, all right, people that have mental health struggles are suffering from their conditions, and they ought to be treated with compassion. Back to the article. Persecutory delusions and command hallucinations. For people with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, studies show that some of the condition's positive symptoms can provoke violence. These include persecutory delusions, such as when a patient thinks people are putting implants in their head or are targeting them with harmful laser beams, particularly when they are also feeling angry or irritable. Another such symptom is command hallucinations, when a patient reports hearing voices that order them to hurt somebody. Grandiosity, grandiose delusions, and mania. Grandiosity, a hallmark of the manic and hypomanic phases of bipolar, can likewise play a role in violence and aggression, studies find. People can be overtaken by an exaggerated sense of their own power, which can stunt their ability to empathize with others and foster a sense of entitlement, including the right to take advantage of or exploit others, Brown explains. Similarly, the high energy that often accompanies mania can lead to violence or aggression on its own terms. A study by Gillian K. Peterson, PhD, oh God, I hope she's not related to that Peterson, an associate professor at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and colleagues, for instance, found that of 429 crimes, 429 crimes committed by 143 offenders with mental illness, 3% related directly to depression, 4% to psychosis, and 10% to bipolar disorder, including impulsivity. And that was published in Law and Human Behavior, Volume 38, Number 5 in 2014. Antisocial personality traits. Violence among people with serious mental illness often goes hand in hand with a youthful history of conduct disorder and a present diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder characterized by disregard for others, deceitfulness, and manipulation of others for personal gain, research also shows. While these disorders are considered in the realm of personality disorders, I talked about that in the video that I did on the alpha, beta, whatever hierarchy as well, dark triad, that sort of thing. So while these disorders are considered in the realm of personality disorders, it is likely that many more people would be placed in a category of people with mental illness and at high risk for violence if these disorders were included, Brown says. Swanson and colleagues examined some of the factors and analysis of data on 1,445 participants who took part in the NIMH clinical antipsychotic trials of intervention effectiveness study conducted in the mid-2000s. People with schizophrenia, they found, were twice as likely to commit violent acts if they had a history of childhood conduct problems, which is at 28%, than if they did not, which is at 14%. That was published in Law and Human Behavior, Volume 32, Number 3, 2008. And in a subset of the most violent patients in the MacArthur study, University of California, Berkeley, psychology professor Jennifer Scheme, PhD, and colleagues found that only 12% had experienced psychotic symptoms before committing a violent act, while the subsample as a whole met criteria for antisocial personality disorder, had long histories of conduct problems, and had difficulty managing anger. And this is Clinical Psychology of Science, Volume 4, Number 1, published in 2016. If you noticed earlier, I was not reading the PhD, the credential aspect of it. I realized that if anybody wants to look up any of these experts, that they would probably want to make sure that they knew whether they're a PhD or whatever doctrines that they held. So let's bring in context into treatment. Clinicians need to consider such complexities when conducting treatment and assessments, say psychologists and others who work with patients with serious mental illness who may be at risk for violent behavior. Each patient needs to be assessed individually to identify factors that seem causally related to acts of violence that have occurred in the past and to focus on intervening with those factors to reduce future risk, says Applebaum. One basic intervention is making sure that people are following treatment protocols, says Shirley M. Glenn, PhD, a clinical and research psychologist at the Seminole Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at the University of California, Los Angeles. When I hear of somebody with a serious mental illness who has acted violently or aggressively, the first thing I ask their clinician is, where are they in terms of their treatment, she says. Often they have let treatment and medications lapse, and if you can help get them back into treatment, a lot of their aggressive or violent behavior settles out. Findings from the CATIE study bear this out, showing that most patients with schizophrenia who took antipsychotics as prescribed were less likely to be violent than those who did not. For people with mental illness who have been incarcerated for violent acts, a good follow-up can prevent recidivism, adds clinical and forensic psychologist Joel Dvoskin, PhD, ABFP, an expert in mental health and criminal justice assessment for more than 4 decades who has served in numerous related leadership capacities for the states of New York, Nevada, Virginia, and Arizona. What you do after people are released matters, says Dvoskin. He strongly encourages check-ins about how former inpatients or inmates are doing and whether or not they are following their medication regimens. Okay. This goes right back to what we've talked about numerous times with recidivism and prisoners, ex-cons. The issue is that society labels these people as such and then make it difficult for them to get a job, to get hired somewhere else. There's a lot of predatory practices that go on as far as the state taking advantage with for-profit prisons that should not be going on as well. And it's in that interest that I would say that same type of thing, external environmental factors that can also pressure people to end up making the same types of, putting them back in the same situation, having that recidivism that obviously we want to discourage. We want to rehabilitate people, not just punish them, then put them back in a situation that's going to almost guarantee that they end right back up in prison. Also important is developing treatments that address family dynamics in relation to a patient's violence, in part because research suggests that about 1 in 5 family members of people with serious mental illness is the target of such violence each year, says psychiatrist Lisa B. Dixon, MD, MPH of the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry. In an article in a special issue of the Harvard Review of Psychiatry, that's volume 29, number 1, published 2021, on violence and mental illness, Travis LeBrum, PhD of the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, Dixon and colleagues reviewed 18 qualitative studies on factors correlated with violence toward family members, including a patient's reliance on family members for financial support and other support, limit setting by family members, and the presence of criticism, hostility, and verbal aggression on both sides. While research on family and caregiver interventions in this area is still limited, promising avenues include helping patients engage in recovery-oriented treatment and strengthening support services that could reduce reliance on family members, says Dixon. Also prominent, it's so funny because when they had talked about offering like to send psychologists or psychiatrists out when patients are having mental health crisis, what was the rhetoric that we heard? Oh, you need to send the police, armed with a gun and stuff, just in case they're too crazy. And the thing is, this research seems like it would support the idea that you can have follow-up visits with these patients at their homes, or encourage them to become more independent, stop relying on their family so much, and offering that additional support, such as having a psychiatrist or psychologist come out to their house if they're under duress, could probably help reduce some of this violence. That actually was a good idea of the left-based. Also promising are evidence-based interventions that support the ability of family members to prevent and manage family conflict, including multi-family group treatment and the National Alliance on Mental Illnesses Family to Family program, a free 8-session educational program for family, friends, and significant others of people with mental illness that guides caregivers in supporting their loved ones and themselves and handling crises before they arise. Meanwhile, strategies targeted to young people, like using internet-based treatments to help engage them, also hold promise. Knowledge about medications is also improving, finds another review article in the 2021 Harvard Review of Psychiatry special issue by psychiatrists Leslie Citram, MD, MPH of New York Medical College in Valhalla, New York, and Jan Volovka, I'm butchering that name, MD, PhD, a professor emeritus at NYU, Langone Health. They find strong evidence that 2 common drugs given to people with schizophrenia, clozapine and olanzapine, can help reduce symptoms of hostility, but that other antipsychotic medications typically prescribed to people with schizophrenia are unlikely to make a difference. Forensic assessment has likewise grown in sophistication, says Davoskin. Currently, there are 2 types of assessment instruments. Actuarial instruments, which calculate a person's likelihood of committing future violence based on a decision-making tree, and structured professional judgment instruments, which use those same tools but give evaluators the ability to make more nuanced decisions based on a person's particular circumstances. While both methods are good predictors of future violence, Davoskin prefers structured professional judgments because it allows us to use clinical judgment to decide how serious a person's risk is. It also provides room to consider dynamic factors that may lead to violence, such as being laid off from work or experiencing domestic violence. I don't think context is a get out of jail free card, says Davoskin, but it's certainly relevant to any risk assessment. Whew, almost getting through this. All right, broader interventions. Oh yes, so others are working to address environmental, situational, contextual roots of violence or aggressive behavior in people with mental illness. There's a link right here. Crisis intervention teams are an example. Now in hundreds of cities and towns around the country, these collaborations between police officers, mental health educators, and community advocates are helping resolve high-intensity police interactions in ways that minimize additional violence. Thank fucking God. In another effort, Glenn and colleagues are conducting statewide trainings with mental health counselors designed to help people with first-time episodes of psychosis return to school or get and keep a job, which can prevent them from developing other kinds of problems. In the policy arena, Swanson and others have been tackling the complicated issues of gun violence and mass violence as they relate to people with mental illness. Besides promulgating research showing that mass shootings account for less than 1% of firearm homicides and tend to be committed by those with issues besides diagnosable mental illnesses, Swanson and others are studying extreme risk protection order laws in 19 states and the District of Columbia. These laws allow family members and police officers to seek a civil restraining order to temporarily remove guns from people who pose an imminent risk of harming themselves or others. And that's published in Harvard Review of Psychiatry, Special Issue, Volume 29, Number 1, published in 2021. When Swanson and colleagues evaluated the efforts of one such policy in Connecticut, they estimated that for every 10 to 20 gun removal actions, the policy prevented one suicide. The team also learned that most of these individuals were men and that the central concern was suicide threat. And that was published in Law and Contemporary Problems, Volume 80, Number 2, 2017. The findings underscore the importance of paying at least as much attention to suicide risk as to violence committed toward others. Swanson adds, since research shows that 46% of those who die from suicide have known mental illness and 60% of deaths from firearms are suicides, it's a big opportunity, he says, because if you can keep a gun out of someone's hand in a moment of despair, they're likely to survive. And people who survive a suicide attempt are unlikely to die from suicide going forward. There's plenty of other links down here for reading further research. And some of the articles mentioned above are also linked down here. Oh, man, that's so much talking. My throat is so sore right now. However, I felt like this issue deserved a lot of attention. I felt that this was a worthwhile effort to make to correct some of the misinformation that we had unfortunately stated previously in a video. And hopefully with the nuances of that article, with the data that is now available, that we'll also put a link in the video below. And with the presentation that we watched at the beginning, hopefully it gives you a better idea that this topic is way more nuanced, way more complicated than the rhetoric of just simply saying if somebody is a mass shooter, they must be mentally ill. And hopefully we're not casting aspersions on people that are already suffering mental illness and casting them in a light that makes them seem like they are dangerous and violent people for no reason other than that they suffer from mental health concerns. I hope that everybody that watches this has a good day, and if you do suffer from some type of mental illness, you have nothing but love from me, and I hope that you live a fulfilling and happy life. And I'm sorry that we have to read stuff like this and talk about these types of subjects. And it's very frustrating that people that are already suffering so much just get dogpiled on even more within our society, because it's easier to see us as like monsters than it is to have compassion for us and actually care about what's going on in our lives. I don't have anything else to say about this, so I will see you in the next video. Bye.